You're all set.
It's good to see. I went to school near here. I'd rather be back up here in like the springtime or the summer. It was a rude awakening to wake up to maybe 4 degrees, but it's still good to be here. And I'm really glad to hear about all of the positive initiatives that are going on and the information that's being shared, and just such a positive sign when people are not in their silos and are kind of sharing information. So what I'm here to just bring to you today is a few opportunities, ways that we might be able to support some of the work that you're doing. It ties in nicely to what Mike Finley talked about with the Burns Institute. In fact, we often work very closely with the Burns Institute in terms of once you're identifying certain target populations that are kind of those, especially those stubborn populations where you're saying we seem to keep having the same issues over and over. For us, it's all about bringing community solutions to those issues, bringing the resources of people in the community, and also doing some of that sharing and team building among non-traditional partners. Anyway, we're in the South Bronx, and it's an area where, looked at your county slide, and we have about the same population kind of crammed into 1 square mile. And so what we did about, I guess it was about 5 years ago, with some support from DCJS, is we really thought, seeing so many kids go through the system, and you've probably all heard about the South Bronx and its place of infamy, you know, the poorest congressional district in the United States. Over there we don't have disproportionate minority contact, we pretty much have total minority contact. But we said, wouldn't it be great if the community could come together and we could actually unite and provide the types of supports that we could keep kids out of the system and kind of keep them from ever kind of going down that slippery slope. And what we were able to do with a grant from DCJS, we were able to put together a collaborative of community organizations, and I'm talking really grassroots, so some churches, some unincorporated groups, as one of you spoke about, but the people on the ground in the neighborhood who wanted to do something to keep youth out of the system. And over about a 3-year period, we, looking at data and talking just to a lot of stakeholders and trying to figure out what was that entry point that are bringing so many young people into the system, found that it was mostly young people who were getting charged with assaults at schools. And it wasn't serious enough for them to get locked up at that point, but the prosecutors and the probation officers would say, yeah, this kid might typically get probation, but we just know the story, and this is the type of kid in the family that we're going to see again and again and again, and then they're going to graduate to the adult system. And we said, wouldn't it be great if we could actually get those kids kind of right around the time of their first offense? And so we were able to do that, starting out with the prosecutors, but then developing relationships with probation, also with the schools, also with the police, to say any kid in our zip code, basically, any kid in about a 1 square mile area who kind of falls into that category of a first or second time offender, could you send them to us instead of putting them through the court? And what we did is we matched them up with folks from different small community organizations, matched them up with mentors who were credible messengers. We worked very closely with the families using a peer-to-peer support model. And what we saw was that with an independent evaluation from John Jay College of Criminal Justice, is that our kids were a third less likely to be rearrested than the comparison group. And we're still going to be able to keep running the data year after year. But what I think you're going to see is that over time, you're going to see a widening difference between the kids that we intervened in early at the point of their first arrest and kind of wrapped them up with community support, as to the track record of them, when they're 16, 17, 18, the amount of time they spend in state prison or in county jail. So we were pretty excited about the results, and of course people started to ask, well, can we replicate your program? Can we do it where we're doing it? And what we wanted to say, here's the exciting thing too. People told us, right, we said we want to get kids right when they first get into trouble, and we want to get them either with no mandate or just with a 60-day mandate, right, like the probation adjustment, or sometimes a 120-day decline to prosecute. And we said, but look, we'll serve these kids for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and people said, you're crazy. These kids are never going to go to services if they're not mandated. They just don't like to do that, right? Once the mandate is up, they're going to disappear. We said, well, we believe a couple things. We think, one, that because it's so local and it's places where kids can walk to and where the community members live in the same neighborhood as the kids, we think we can hang on to them. And the second piece was we said, well, we think that because what we're offering them, it's not kind of the traditional services, the kind of risk and need-based stuff where it's, you know, the stuff that you kind of, you know, the anger management, the mental health, the substance abuse stuff that you got to work on, but it's not necessarily what you wake up in the morning kind of thinking, boy, I can't wait to, you know, work on my problems and issues, right? So we want to get kids plugged into stuff that's fun, where they get new peer groups, where they do things that don't really have an expiration date in terms of them being involved. Basically positive youth development activities. The types of activities that the so-called bad kids don't usually gravitate towards and people don't usually pull them into. What we found was that the average kid was mandated to us for 60 days. The average kid participated with us for 209 days, right? So about almost 4 times as long voluntarily. And this is actually old data, but what we saw was that when we engaged the kids kind of really intensively up front and engaged their families and got them plugged into multiple activities, they stayed with us for over a year. This data is about a year old. We continue to track the numbers, and what we've seen is that our core premise is holding true, that the young people who connected with us even from 2 or 3 years ago, a lot are still with us. And they're not actually even with us per se, but they are participating in some way with different community partners that just have these ongoing activities. And again, the ongoing activities are not the stuff that you would imagine as a juvenile justice treatment, right? But it's things like there's a community garden that just has a great guy who just gets the kids involved in urban farming, right? You wouldn't think of it. You wouldn't think that like gang members and but they love it. They're like they grow garlic and stuff, and you know they play with chickens, and you know I always get a kick out of it because it's like look at what you're doing. You know you're growing vegetables, but it's art programs, it's youth leadership programs, and really what it is that positive peer environment where they're sticking around with the people who they're connected to, and in fact their families are connecting, and their families are becoming in a lot of ways what we would call the referral source, right? So there's no way that we're getting these high-risk kids at age 13, 14 and just fixing them up in 60 days or 6 months and sending them on their way. They're continuing to go through issues, they're continuing to go through problems, but we have things of where parents who used to call the police on their kids instead are calling another parent, right? We have things where there is some type of issue between young people that's going on in the neighborhood, and one of our mentors or one of our program people from one of our partner organizations steps in and winds up doing a restorative conference or something before even an arrest is made. And so this approach that we had, which we thought it was pretty successful. When people said, can we replicate your program? And we said, you absolutely can't replicate our program, and you can't replicate it because it's built on the strengths of local community partners. But what you can do is you can replicate the approach by finding your own local community partners, finding your own youth development specialist, your own family engagement specialist, your own youth leaders, and those folks are actually there in every community, even the ones that have been looked upon historically as kind of the most resource deprived. So what we have been able to do with DCJS now is DCJS has said, well, we'd like to help you guys or provide some resources for folks to replicate some of this approach and to allocate some resources for what we call community capacity building. And we define community capacity building as a structured and intentional process that involves bringing and training and equipping the stakeholders who are most affected and impacted by youth crime and delinquency. And that's really the young people themselves, their family members, and the local neighborhood organizations to be primary responders to youthful misbehavior. And so what we're saying essentially is not that we're looking for them to replace you guys. But what we have been able to do with DCJS now is DCJS has said, well, we'd like to help you guys or provide some resources for folks to replicate some of this approach and to allocate some resources for what we call community capacity building. And we define community capacity building as a structured and intentional process that involves bringing and training and equipping the stakeholders who are most affected and impacted by youth crime and delinquency. And that's really the young people themselves, their family members, and the local neighborhood organizations to be primary responders to youthful misbehavior. And so what we're saying essentially is not that we're looking for them to replace you guys as system stakeholders, although that would be nice if you didn't need to respond to anything at all, but that there's a whole lot of stuff that if you guys had some people in the communities
who would respond either beforehand or at the same time or with you, that they would be able to get involved and do some things with these youth that kind of come from within the community and can be self-sustaining on their own. And so what we do, the first thing is to develop strategies to bring the resources of these directly affected communities to bear on some of the most challenging target populations or decision points. This is where we work really closely with the Burns Institute. So if any of you have done the racial and ethnic disparities analysis, and you've really boiled the numbers down to some very defined target populations, it might be something like saying, boy, this is something that we did with Burns in Monmouth County, New Jersey, saying that when you kind of got down in the numbers, you saw that all of the probation violations and detention disparities were primarily driven by African American males, 14 to 18, who were getting violated for not attending their programs, right? And that's kind of where the big disparity was. They were spending more time in detention. They were going back more frequently. And they said, well, the problem is not that there's no services, because they're mandated to services. The problem is just they're not going to services. And they're not going to services, so then the judge gets mad and sends them back to detention for a couple of weeks, and they come back out mandated to the same services. They don't go back in detention. It's just kind of a cycle. And so what we did with Burns was we set up what we called a community coaching project, where we basically got 3 people from the community, 2 of whom were actually young adults who had recently successfully finished their probation, to be peer coaches for these young people, and basically just kind of help them comply with their probation. And that really brought down the violations and brought down the disparities. But at the same time, too, it also developed this very positive culture at this local community organization of young people helping young people. But of course, what we do as well is strengthen the ability of local communities to take care of youth in their neighborhoods. What we see a lot is that the community organizations that often have the most to give from a social level and an engagement level often have a lot of the least training, the least resources, the least funding. And so we look for ways to strengthen that infrastructure a little bit, so that maybe people who are doing this on a volunteer basis can do this on a part-time basis, or people who are doing it on a part-time basis can do this on a full-time basis. And most importantly, it's about developing meaningful collaborative partnerships between system and community stakeholders. I loved what you said just earlier, that a lot of times in these trainings, we used to do these just with community stakeholders, and then we'd see other trainings that were just with system stakeholders, and there was kind of this richness of information that should have been being exchanged and communicated, and it wasn't. And so we've started to do our trainings where we'll say we're going to have 50% traditional system players in the room and 50% non-traditional partners, and often the content of the training is even secondary to people who are saying, you know what, we never spent this much time in a room together, but now we're starting to trust one another, we're starting to get a common sense of mission and want to do some stuff together. So there's a few things that we kind of offer as distinct help. One is kind of the process of facilitating these meaningful system and community partnerships. The second thing is with the youth engagement and thinking about how can you integrate some of these positive youth development principles, specifically by collaborating, again, with those people in the neighborhood who are just doing really attractive, exciting stuff with youth, and try to get them hooked into things where they forget they're mandated, or it just becomes part of their life and their network. We do a lot on family engagement. We have found that probably the best thing that we ever did was to start to use parent-peer coaches. And what that is using a parent who's been through the system to be a coach to another parent, just as there are a lot of parents who I'm sure you know get to the place where they're going to the probation officer and saying, I'm done, I can't do it anymore, place him, I'm tired of it, like I just can't handle him anymore, and that's kind of the end for the kid. And a lot of it is just a parent-peer coach who's helping to walk that parent back from the edge and get them to try a little bit more and get some support and some techniques. And then also figuring out how do you do these partnerships with the smaller grassroots organizations, the ones maybe who've never had a government contract, they've never formally partnered with a system, that they have a lot to give, but they don't really know how this whole world works, right? So we talk about that walk through the system, and you all represent different agencies, and for some folks in the community, it's just one big blob that's the system, right? And it's starting to figure out, well, what are the points of decision and where can we meaningfully partner? So that's kind of what we do for training. what we have available for you guys at this point, the first thing is strategy consultation. So if your regional youth justice team or a specific county says, you know what, like I'm hearing what you're talking about bringing community resources to bear on some of these challenging issues, and we already know that we have this group that we're struggling with. It might be Hispanic girls in this part of Rochester or something, and we would like to develop a specific community partnership to address that. That's something that we can kind of help talk you through and develop a good strategy for. Some folks like to go through our community capacity building diagnostic assessment, which is basically kind of looking at, well, what is sort of the level of your community partnerships and your investment in community organizations? And a big part of what we do, again, is to look for ways, how can you do some really smart funding that would bring some sustainability to these initiatives? And one thing is with something like the SJSTP funds. How many folks are using those in your counties? If you don't know what it is, it's basically you buy a program for $1 and the state pays for 62 cents of that. So that's a good deal. If I had a choice to go to a pizzeria and they said you could get this slice for $1 and the store will give you back 62 cents, then I'd probably buy that pizza. But we've gotten some initiatives up and running in New York under that SJSTP, and would love to kind of also consult with you on how you could do some of these similar things with very kind of smart funding priorities to invest in community organizations. We do some basic workshops and seminars that just sort of talk about the principles, and that's to kind of get people just thinking along the same page. These can be done by webinar, because I know it's tough to get people all together. We've done a couple by webinar already, and this is on your piece of paper. One thing that is always a great and dynamic experience is our 3-day Alternative to Incarceration Training Institute. And typically the way that we do that is it's to, in a certain area, if there's a number of, say, community folks who are really interested in getting involved with kids in the justice system, but again, they don't know your lingo, they don't know these principles of the risk, need, and strength, and all this type of stuff. Sometimes it's even for folks who don't know the juvenile justice system that well, right? Who are maybe coming in from education or child welfare, and still, right, like our systems are often a mystery, but we kind of put folks through a 3-day training together, which is kind of on all of the best practices in community-based alternatives. But then a lot of it is kind of thinking together of how can we collaborate to work on some of those really tough decision points where we do see not a whole lot of traditional success. And so I think we're going to be doing one of these in Albany, probably around April or May, but depending on interest, we can come up and do it in a certain region. In those, what we find is really important that we kind of have a very mixed crowd of system and community stakeholders, and it's a way of getting some collaborative going. And then what we offer as well is, again, some of you may have already been thinking through this, and bring the community around these kids. Could we do something amazing? It's got to be operationalized, meaning that it doesn't, it's not just an idea, right? But it's figuring out, well, how are we going to do this, right? And how are we going to coordinate? You all know how tough it is to coordinate services across systems. It can be equally challenging, if not more, to kind of coordinate those community linkages, but it can be done. But it often needs those meetings and that structure. And then is it sustainable? Because what I see a lot is community folks volunteering to do incredible things, but then kind of, their own resources are running out, and we say, man, sometimes those small investments, $10,000, $25,000, $50,000, to bring on the right people can be amazing. And so that's the type of stuff that we try to help you think through. To be honest, we're figuring out this whole thing as we go. This opportunity came on us kind of quickly, and we're just getting wrapped up. As Grant shared, we have about 6 months to kind of use these trainings and consulting services. The good news is that it's free to you, right? DCJS is paying for it. That's kind of been the theme of the day. But if you're interested in any of these trainings, probably the best thing is just for us to get on the phone and have kind of like a diagnostic conversation and figure out what would be the most meaningful and impactful. And you can either contact us directly. It's best to contact my training director because I'm traveling a lot. Her information is up here. You could go to our website, ccfy.org, and fill out a training request, or you can just reach out directly to your DCJS rep and say, hey, in our city or in our county or in our area, we've been wanting to do something around this, and we think we could use CCFY's help. And then we'll just get on the phone and figure out what would be the most strategic and impactful to make that happen. So that's my spiel. Any questions?
Can I make a comment?
Sure.